The morning mist still clung to the mountains surrounding the small village of San Salvador, when Sister Margaret Rose walked barefoot across the clay tiles of the mission courtyard. December the 2nd, 1980. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and coffee beans, familiar aromas that had greeted her every morning for the past 3 years. She paused by the well, listening to the distant sound of children's laughter echoing from the schoolhouse, where Sister Dorothy was already teaching the morning lessons. In her weathered hands, she held a letter that had arrived the previous evening, correspondence from her sister back in Milwaukee, filled with news of snow and Christmas preparations. The contrast felt surreal. Here, in this corner of El Salvador, December meant something entirely different. It meant uncertainty. It meant watching the horizon for signs of trouble. It meant praying that another day would pass peacefully in their small sanctuary of hope. Sister Margaret Rose, at 52, had the kind of presence that made children run to her and adults seek her counsel. Her grey hair was always neatly tucked beneath her simple veil, and her blue eyes held a warmth that seemed to understand suffering without judgment. She had come to El Salvador with Sister Dorothy in 1977, drawn by a calling that felt as natural as breathing, to serve where they were needed most. The mission sat at the edge of the village like a protective embrace. Adobe walls enclosed a modest chapel, a schoolhouse, a clinic, and living quarters that the sisters shared with remarkable contentment. Bougainvillea climbed the walls in cascades of purple and pink, and a small vegetable garden provided both sustenance and a place for quiet reflection. It was here that they had built something precious: trust. The villagers had been cautious at first. 2 American nuns arriving during such turbulent times raised questions and whispers. But Sister Margaret Rose and Sister Dorothy had won them over, not with grand gestures, but with small, consistent acts of kindness. They learned Spanish with determination and humility, sitting in evening circles with the women, practicing pronunciation while helping to shell beans or mend clothes. They celebrated baptisms and mourned losses. They opened their clinic to anyone who needed care, regardless of their ability to pay or their political affiliations. Sister Dorothy, younger at 38, possessed an infectious energy that seemed to multiply the hours in each day. Where Sister Margaret Rose was contemplative, Dorothy was action personified. She could teach a mathematics lesson in the morning, assist with a difficult birth in the afternoon, and still have energy to organize evening literacy classes for the adults. Her dark hair often escaped its pins by midday, framing a face that was quick to smile and slow to judge. Together, they had created something that felt almost magical in its simplicity, a place where hope could exist alongside fear, where education could flourish despite uncertainty, where healing could happen even when the world outside seemed determined to tear itself apart. The political situation in El Salvador had been deteriorating for months. Conversations in the village were conducted in hushed tones, and families spoke of relatives who had simply vanished, some joining the guerrillas in the mountains, others fleeing north toward the United States, still others disappearing into a silence that no one dared to question too directly. The sisters had received warnings, gentle suggestions that perhaps their work here was complete, that it might be time to consider returning to the safety of the United States. But how do you abandon a place that has become home? How do you leave behind children who run to greet you each morning, women who trust you with their most private fears, men who nod respectfully as you pass, acknowledging the good work you've done? Sister Margaret Rose had wrestled with these questions in her evening prayers, seeking guidance that seemed to remain just beyond her reach. The letter from her sister in Milwaukee mentioned Christmas plans, asked about her safety, and enclosed a small photograph of their parents' house decorated with lights. Sister Margaret Rose studied the image, remembering winters of her childhood, the security of predictable seasons, the luxury of planning for the future without wondering if that future would arrive. It felt like looking at someone else's life, beautiful but impossibly distant. As she folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, Sister Dorothy emerged from the schoolhouse, her arms full of children's notebooks. Her face bore the concentrated expression she wore when mentally organizing the day's tasks, a look that Sister Margaret Rose had come to find both endearing and slightly exhausting. "The children are asking about the Christmas pageant again," Dorothy said, setting the notebooks down on a wooden bench. "Little Anna wants to know if her baby brother can play the Christ child." and Miguel insists he should be Joseph because he's the tallest boy in class. She paused, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I told them we'd have the most beautiful pageant the village has ever seen. Sister Margaret Rose smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that Dorothy's optimism always kindled. And we will. We'll string lights in the chapel, and Maria's mother said she could help with costumes. She hesitated for a moment. Have you given any more thought to what Father Miguel said yesterday? The question hung in the morning air between them. Father Miguel, the elderly priest who served several villages in the region, had stopped by the previous afternoon with news that was becoming increasingly common. Another mission had closed, its workers relocated to safer areas. He had spoken carefully, diplomatically, but his message was clear. The American sisters were becoming targets simply by virtue of their nationality and their presence in a region where loyalties were questioned and neutrality was becoming impossible to maintain. Dorothy's expression grew serious. I've thought about it, she said slowly, but I keep coming back to the same question. If we leave now, who will continue the work? The clinic is finally running smoothly. The children are reading at levels we never dreamed possible when we started. The women's cooperative is beginning to turn a real profit. She gestured toward the village, where smoke was beginning to rise from morning cooking fires. How do we walk away from all of this? Sister Margaret Rose understood the conflict because she felt it too, the tension between self-preservation and purpose, between the logical decision and the calling of the heart. They had built something meaningful here, something that would be difficult to replicate elsewhere. The connections they had formed weren't just professional, they were deeply personal, woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that made departure feel like abandonment. If this story moved you, you might want to subscribe. We tell stories like this every day, stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary moments of choice. As the morning progressed, the sisters fell into their familiar routine. Sister Margaret Rose opened the clinic, preparing supplies for the day's patients, while Sister Dorothy continued her lessons. The sounds of village life surrounded them. Women calling to each other across courtyards, the rhythmic sound of corn being ground for tortillas, children's voices raised in the songs Dorothy had taught them, the distant lowing of cattle being led to pasture. By midday, the clinic had seen its usual stream of patients, children with minor injuries, elderly villagers managing chronic conditions, a young mother seeking prenatal care. Each interaction was a small reminder of why they had stayed, why the decision to leave felt so impossible. These were not abstract beneficiaries of charity, they were neighbors, friends, people whose lives had become intertwined with their own. In the early afternoon, as Sister Margaret Rose was organizing medical supplies, she noticed a change in the atmosphere outside. The usual background sounds of village life had grown quieter, replaced by an undercurrent of tension that she had learned to recognize over the past months. Conversations were conducted in lower voices. People moved with more purpose and less leisure. Children were called inside earlier than usual. Sister Dorothy appeared in the clinic doorway, her face troubled. "Have you noticed anything unusual today?" she asked quietly. Sister Margaret Rose nodded. "The village feels different, watchful." They had learned to read these subtle shifts in mood, understanding that in a place where information traveled through whispers and glances, changes in the atmosphere often preceded more concrete developments. It was a skill that had kept them safe during previous moments of tension, helping them to know when to remain quietly inside their mission walls and when it was safe to venture into the village. As evening approached, they completed their daily routines with particular attention to detail, as if ensuring that everything was left in perfect order. Sister Margaret Rose updated her medical records and secured the clinic supplies. Sister Dorothy prepared lesson plans for the following week and organized the children's notebooks with unusual care. They shared a simple dinner of rice, beans, and fresh tortillas, accompanied by tea made from herbs grown in their garden. The conversation during dinner was gentle, focusing on small details of the day rather than the larger concerns that both of them felt, but neither wanted to voice directly. They discussed plans for the Christmas pageant, laughed about Miguel's earnest insistence that he was tall enough to play Joseph, and made plans to visit Anna's family the following day to see the new baby, who might indeed make a perfect Christ child for their celebration. As darkness settled over the village, the sisters prepared for evening prayers in the small chapel attached to their living quarters. The space was simple but beautiful, with wooden pews that local craftsmen had made as a gift, and windows that let in the soft light of stars and moon. They had said these prayers together hundreds of times, their voices blending in familiar rhythms of gratitude and supplication. That night, their prayers carried an additional weight of uncertainty, though neither sister spoke of it directly. They prayed for the safety of the villagers, for wisdom in their decisions, for strength to continue their work, and for peace in a land that seemed to grow more troubled with each passing day. They prayed, as they always did, for guidance in knowing God's will for their lives. After prayers, they followed their usual evening routine, reviewing the next day's schedule, checking that doors were securely locked, and ensuring that emergency supplies were easily accessible. These had become necessary precautions, small preparations that allowed them to sleep more peacefully in uncertain times. Sister Margaret Rose sat at the small table in her room, writing in the journal she had kept since arriving in El Salvador. Her entries had evolved over the years from excited accounts of new experiences to more reflective observations about the complexities of service in a troubled region. Tonight, she wrote about the children's enthusiasm for the Christmas pageant, about the successful treatment of an elderly man's infected wound, about the satisfaction of seeing the women's cooperative continue to grow and flourish. She also wrote, though more carefully, about the sense of change in the air, about the weight of responsibility they felt toward the people who had trusted them, and about the difficulty of discerning the right path forward when both staying and leaving carried such significant risks and consequences. As she prepared for sleep, Sister Margaret Rose could hear the familiar nighttime sounds of the village settling into rest, doors closing, conversations ending, the distant sound of someone playing a guitar softly in the darkness. These sounds had become the lullaby of her life in El Salvador, as comforting and essential as her own heartbeat. Neither sister knew, as they settled into sleep that night, that December 2nd, 1980, would be their last evening in the mission that had become their home, their last night among the people they had come to love as family, their last opportunity to hear the gentle sounds of village life surrounding them in peaceful darkness. The morning would bring visitors, questions, and a departure that would launch one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of American missionary work in Central America, a mystery that would remain unsolved for 30 years until a hollowed-out Bible revealed secrets that no one could have imagined. December 3rd, 1980, dawned gray and humid, with clouds hanging low over the mountains like a heavy blanket. Sister Margaret Rose woke before sunrise, as was her custom, but something felt different. The usual symphony of birds that greeted each morning seemed muted, and even the roosters crowed with less enthusiasm. She dressed quietly, not wanting to disturb Sister Dorothy, and made her way to the small kitchen to prepare their morning coffee. As she ground the coffee beans, a luxury they afforded themselves each morning, purchased from a local farmer whose children attended Dorothy's school, she noticed an unusual quiet from the village. No smoke yet rose from the cooking fires, no children's voices carried on the morning air. The silence felt expectant, as if the entire village was holding its breath. Sister Dorothy appeared in the kitchen doorway earlier than usual, already dressed and alert. Her dark hair was neatly pinned, but her eyes held a tension that Sister Margaret Rose had learned to recognize during their years together. "Did you sleep well?" Dorothy asked, though her tone suggested she knew the answer. "Not particularly," Sister Margaret Rose admitted, pouring coffee into their simple ceramic cups. "I kept waking up, listening. Did you hear anything during the night?" "Vehicles," Dorothy said quietly, accepting her coffee with grateful hands. "Several times. Not the usual sounds, these were different. Military vehicles, I think. They stopped and started as if they were checking different locations." The sisters had developed an intuitive understanding of the sounds that surrounded their mission. They could distinguish between the rattling bus that brought supplies from San Salvador twice a week, the pickup trucks that local farmers drove to market, and the heavier, more ominous sound of military or government vehicles. Last night's traffic had definitely fallen into the latter category. They sat at their small table, sharing breakfast in thoughtful silence. Through the window, they could see that the village was beginning to stir, but slowly, cautiously. Women emerged from their homes to tend cooking fires, but they moved quickly and stayed close to their doorways. Children appeared briefly before being called back inside. Even the dogs seemed subdued, lying quietly in whatever shade they could find. Around 9 in the morning, as Sister Margaret Rose was organizing supplies in the clinic and Sister Dorothy was preparing lesson plans, they heard the distinctive sound of vehicles approaching the mission. Not one vehicle, but several. The engines had the deep, powerful sound that meant official business rather than friendly visits. Sister Dorothy appeared at the clinic door, her face carefully composed, but her eyes alert. "Should we?" she began, then stopped. They had discussed this moment many times, what they would do if official visitors arrived, how they would respond to questions about their work, their loyalties, their connections within the village. "We continue as normal," Sister Margaret Rose said firmly, though her heart was beating faster. "We have nothing to hide. Our work here speaks for itself." The vehicles stopped outside the mission walls, engines idling for a moment before shutting off. Car doors slammed with the sharp finality of official business. Voices spoke in rapid Spanish, too distant and muffled for the sisters to make out specific words, but the tone was businesslike, formal, not threatening, but certainly not social. A firm knock came at the mission gate, not the gentle rap of villagers seeking medical attention or the enthusiastic pounding of children hoping to start school early, but the authoritative knock of people who expected to be answered promptly. Sister Margaret Rose smoothed her simple dress and walked to the gate, Sister Dorothy beside her. Through the wooden slats they could see several men in uniform, not the local police they knew by name, but military personnel from San Salvador, or perhaps a regional command. One man in civilian clothes stood slightly apart from the others, his demeanor suggesting he was in charge of this visit. "Sisters," the civilian called out in accented English, "we would like to speak with you, please." "We are with the Government Security Office." Sister Margaret Rose lifted the simple wooden latch and opened the gate, stepping back to allow the men to enter. There were 5 of them in total, 3 in military uniform, 1 in police dress, and the civilian who had spoken. All were armed, though their weapons remained holstered. Their presence transformed the peaceful courtyard into something formal and tense. "Good morning," Sister Margaret Rose said in Spanish, then switched to English. "I am Sister Margaret Rose, and this is Sister Dorothy. How may we help you?" The civilian, a man in his 40s with careful eyes and a mustache that was meticulously maintained, introduced himself as Captain Rodriguez from the Regional Security Office. He spoke English well, though with deliberate precision that suggested it was not his first language. "We are conducting interviews with foreign nationals working in this region," he explained. "There have been some concerns about security, and we want to ensure that everyone is safe and that all activities are properly documented." Sister Dorothy stepped forward slightly. "Of course. We're happy to answer any questions. Would you like to sit down? We can offer you coffee." It was a gesture that came naturally to her, the hospitality that had been central to their work in the village, but Captain Rodriguez declined with a polite but firm shake of his head. "This is an official interview," he said. "We prefer to conduct it formally." What followed was an hour of careful questioning that felt more like an interrogation than an interview, though the tone remained officially polite throughout. Captain Rodriguez asked about their work in the village, how long they had been there, what organizations had sent them, who funded their activities, what their relationship was with local residents, whether they had been approached by any political groups, what they knew about guerrilla activities in the region. Sister Margaret Rose answered each question honestly and completely. She explained their affiliation with their religious order, the funding that came from their home diocese in Milwaukee, the purely humanitarian nature of their work. She described their medical clinic, the school programs, the women's cooperative, all activities that were conducted openly and benefited the entire village regardless of political affiliation. Sister Dorothy provided additional details about their educational programs, showing the visitors through the schoolhouse and explaining their curriculum. The children's notebooks were still stacked on the wooden bench where she had left them the previous afternoon, evidence of normal, innocent activity that had nothing to do with politics or insurgency. But as the interview continued, it became clear that Captain Rodriguez and his colleagues were looking for something more than simple documentation of missionary work. Their questions became more specific, more pointed. Had the sisters noticed any unusual activity in the village? Had strangers approached them with requests for assistance? Had they been asked to carry messages or transport people? Did they know the whereabouts of certain villagers who had not been seen recently? The sisters answered truthfully. They had noticed the general tension that affected everyone in the region, but they had no knowledge of specific political activities. Their work brought them into contact with many villagers, but always in the context of education, medical care, or community development. They had not been approached by anyone seeking to involve them in political activities of any kind. Captain Rodriguez listened to their answers with an expression that revealed nothing. He took notes in a small leather notebook, occasionally conferring quietly with his colleagues in rapid Spanish that was too quick and too quiet for the sisters to follow completely. The other men spread out through the mission grounds, examining the clinic, the living quarters, the chapel, always politely but with the thoroughness of a professional search. As the interview progressed, Sister Margaret Rose began to realize that this visit was not routine documentation. The questions were too specific, the search too thorough, the atmosphere too tense for a simple administrative check. Something had prompted this visit, some information, some suspicion, some event that they were not being told about directly. "Sisters," Captain Rodriguez said finally, closing his notebook with deliberate care, "I must inform you that there have been some developments in this region that affect the security situation. We have information suggesting that foreign nationals may be at risk, particularly those working in isolated areas like this village." Sister Dorothy exchanged a glance with Sister Margaret Rose before responding. "What kind of developments? Are the villagers in danger? The children?" "We cannot discuss specific intelligence matters," Captain Rodriguez replied. "But we strongly recommend that you consider relocating to a safer area, at least temporarily. We can arrange transportation to San Salvador, where you can stay with other religious personnel until the situation stabilizes." The offer was presented as a recommendation, but something in Captain Rodriguez's tone made it clear that it was more than a suggestion. Sister Margaret Rose felt a chill of understanding. They were not being given a choice. This was not a friendly warning. It was an official order disguised as helpful advice. "When would this relocation need to take place?" Sister Margaret Rose asked carefully. "Today," Captain Rodriguez said. "This afternoon. We can provide transportation and ensure your personal belongings are safely packed and transported." The words fell into the morning air like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through both sisters. Today, this afternoon. After 3 years of building relationships, establishing trust, creating programs that were finally beginning to show real results, it was all supposed to end in a matter of hours. Sister Dorothy found her voice first. "Captain Rodriguez, with respect, we have responsibilities here. The clinic has patients scheduled for this afternoon. I have lessons planned for tomorrow. There's a Christmas pageant that the children have been preparing for weeks. We can't simply abandon everything without notice." Captain Rodriguez's expression softened slightly, but his resolve did not waver. "Sister, I understand your commitment to your work here, and I respect it. But the security situation has changed significantly in the past week. We have information that suggests this village may become a target of military action soon. We cannot guarantee your safety if you remain." The full weight of the situation began to settle over both sisters. Military action, targets. The gentle morning routine they had shared just hours earlier now felt like it belonged to a different world, a different life. The sounds of the village around them, children beginning to venture outside, women starting their daily tasks, suddenly seemed precious and fragile. "Could we have a few minutes to discuss this privately?" Sister Margaret Rose asked. Captain Rodriguez nodded and stepped away with his colleagues, moving to the far end of the courtyard where they could maintain visual supervision while allowing the sisters some privacy for conversation. Sister Margaret Rose and Sister Dorothy stood together in the morning shadow of the chapel, where they had prayed just the night before. Everything around them looked exactly the same as it had 24 hours earlier, but everything had changed completely. "What do you think?" Sister Dorothy whispered. "I think we don't have a choice," Sister Margaret Rose replied quietly. "Not really. This isn't a request. It's an order." Sister Dorothy nodded slowly. "But the villagers, how do we tell them? How do we explain that we're leaving without warning, that we don't know when or if we'll be back? It was the question that cut deepest. These were not abstract beneficiaries of their charity. They were friends, neighbors, people who had trusted them with their children's education, their health concerns, their hopes for a better future. How do you say goodbye to 3 years of relationships in a matter of hours? We tell them the truth, Sister Margaret Rose said finally, that circumstances beyond our control are forcing us to leave temporarily, but that we'll return as soon as it's possible. Even as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them herself. In her experience, when situations like this forced people to leave, returning was rarely as simple as hoped. But what else could they tell the children who would arrive at school that afternoon expecting their lessons? What else could they tell the women who depended on the clinic for basic medical care? Captain Rodriguez approached them again, his expression patient but firm. "Sisters, we need to begin preparations for departure. We have other stops to make today, and travel becomes more difficult after dark." Sister Margaret Rose nodded. "We understand. We'll need some time to pack our essential belongings and to inform the villagers of our departure." "We will assist with packing," Captain Rodriguez said. "As for informing the villagers, we prefer that you keep explanations brief and general. Tell them that you are being relocated for safety reasons and that you hope to return when conditions permit." The packing took 2 hours. The sisters moved through their small living quarters like people in a dream, selecting items that seemed important in the moment, but wondering if they would matter wherever they were going. Sister Margaret Rose packed her medical supplies and patient records, unwilling to leave behind information that might be needed by whoever took over the clinic. Sister Dorothy packed the children's notebooks and lesson plans, hoping against hope that she would be able to complete the work they had started together. They each packed a single suitcase of personal belongings, changes of clothing, toiletries, a few photographs from home, letters from family and their Bibles. Sister Margaret Rose included her journal and a few medical texts. Sister Dorothy packed some children's books and educational materials. As they packed, villagers began to gather outside the mission walls. Word had spread quickly, as it always did in small communities, that something unusual was happening. Children pressed their faces against the gate, trying to understand why their teachers were putting things into boxes. Women arrived with questions and worried expressions. Even some of the men, who usually worked in the fields during the day, appeared to see what was happening. The most difficult moment came when Sister Dorothy had to explain to the children that school would not be meeting that afternoon or the next day. Little Anna, the girl who had wanted her baby brother to play the Christ child in the Christmas pageant, began to cry. Miguel, the boy who had been so excited about playing Joseph, asked repeatedly when the sisters would return. "We don't know," Sister Dorothy had to answer honestly. "We hope it will be soon, but we don't know." Sister Margaret Rose spoke with Maria, the village woman who had been helping to organize the women's cooperative. Maria's weathered hands twisted the fabric of her apron as she listened to the explanation about safety concerns and temporary relocation. "Sister," Maria said quietly, "we will miss you. You have been good to us. You have been our friends." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 3 years of shared experiences, of trust built through small daily kindnesses, of relationships that had grown from professional duty to genuine affection. As the afternoon wore on and departure time approached, the mood around the mission grew increasingly somber. The sisters had said goodbye to communities before. It was part of missionary work, but never under circumstances like these, never with such uncertainty about the future, never with such a sense that they were abandoning people who depended on them. Captain Rodriguez and his colleagues loaded the sisters' belongings into one of the vehicles. They were professional but not unkind, understanding that this was difficult for everyone involved. Captain Rodriguez himself seemed genuinely concerned for the sisters' safety, though he could not or would not provide details about the specific threats that had prompted their sudden relocation. At 4 in the afternoon, as the December sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, Sister Margaret Rose and Sister Dorothy climbed into the back seat of a government vehicle that would take them away from the village that had been their home, the people who had become their family, and the work that had given their lives purpose and meaning. As the vehicle pulled away from the mission, both sisters turned to look back at the villagers who had gathered to wave goodbye. Children ran alongside the car for a few hundred yards, before being called back by their parents. Adults stood in doorways or by the roadside, raising their hands in farewell gestures that seemed to hold both blessing and sorrow. The last thing Sister Margaret Rose saw was the mission itself, the adobe walls that had sheltered their simple life, the bougainvillea that would continue to bloom without them, the small chapel where they had prayed each evening for the safety and well-being of the people they had come to love. Neither sister knew, as the vehicle carried them toward an uncertain future, that they would never see the village again, never return to complete the work they had started, never fulfill the promise of return that they had made to children and adults who had trusted them with their hopes. They also did not know that within hours of their departure, the village would experience events that would make international headlines, events that would transform their sudden relocation from an administrative inconvenience into something far more mysterious and troubling. The 30-year silence that would follow their disappearance had begun, and it would take a hollowed-out Bible hidden in a place no one thought to look to finally reveal what had really happened on that gray December afternoon when 2 American nuns vanished from El Salvador. The government vehicle moved through the Salvadoran countryside with the steady rhythm of official business, its occupants maintaining a silence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. Sister Margaret Rose sat behind the driver, watching familiar landscapes blur past the window, coffee plantations clinging to steep hillsides, small settlements where laundry hung like colorful flags in front yards, children walking along the roadside with the careful balance of those accustomed to sharing narrow spaces with passing traffic. Beside her, Sister Dorothy held her small bag tightly, occasionally reaching inside to touch the children's notebooks she had insisted on bringing. Her eyes remained fixed on the window, but Sister Margaret Rose could tell she wasn't really seeing the scenery. Instead, she seemed to be replaying the afternoon's events, trying to make sense of how quickly their ordered life had transformed into this uncertain journey. Captain Rodriguez sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally speaking quietly into a radio handset in rapid Spanish that was too quick and too technical for the sisters to follow completely. The fragments they could understand were routine, confirmations of location, estimated arrival times, requests for status updates. Nothing that revealed their destination or explained the urgency that had driven their sudden departure. As the afternoon progressed and the vehicle continued its steady progress away from their village, Sister Margaret Rose began to notice that they were not heading toward San Salvador, as Captain Rodriguez had initially indicated. The road they traveled was smaller than the main highway, winding through more remote areas where settlements were farther apart, and the evidence of government or military presence was less visible. "Captain Rodriguez," she said carefully, leaning forward slightly, "could you tell us where we're going? This doesn't seem to be the route to San Salvador." The captain turned in his seat to face them, his expression patient but unrevealing. "There has been a change in plans, sister. We have received information that makes San Salvador temporarily unsuitable for your relocation. We are taking you to a safer location where you can stay until more permanent arrangements are made." Sister Dorothy looked up from her contemplation of the passing landscape. "What kind of information? Is there danger in San Salvador?" "I cannot discuss specific intelligence matters," Captain Rodriguez replied, using the same phrase he had employed earlier when deflecting their questions. "But I can assure you that this change is in your best interests. The location where we are taking you is secure and comfortable. You will be well cared for." The evasiveness of his answers was becoming increasingly troubling. Sister Margaret Rose had worked in enough bureaucratic situations to recognize when information was being deliberately withheld, and her concern was shifting from inconvenience to genuine worry. Their sudden departure from the village had been presented as a safety measure, but the secrecy surrounding their destination suggested something more complex was happening. The road continued to wind through increasingly remote terrain. They passed fewer villages and encountered less traffic. The landscape grew more rugged, with dense vegetation pressing close to the roadway and mountains rising more steeply on both sides. It was beautiful country, but it was also isolated, the kind of place where help would be far away if it were needed. As evening approached, the vehicle turned onto an even smaller road that was barely more than a dirt track. The ride became rougher, requiring all passengers to hold on as the vehicle navigated ruts and stones. Through the dust kicked up by their passage, Sister Margaret Rose could see that they were approaching some kind of compound, buildings surrounded by a high fence, with guards visible at a gate that opened to allow their vehicle to pass through. The compound was clearly military or government-related, though it bore no obvious identifying markers. Low concrete buildings were arranged around a central courtyard, with communications antennas rising from one structure and vehicles parked in orderly rows. Armed guards moved with the casual alertness of personnel who were accustomed to their duties, but not expecting immediate trouble. Captain Rodriguez stepped out of the vehicle and spoke briefly with one of the guards before returning to assist the sisters with their luggage. "This is a secure facility," he explained as they gathered their belongings. "You will be staying here temporarily while we assess the security situation in your region and make arrangements for your long-term relocation." Sister Dorothy looked around the compound with obvious unease. "How long is temporarily? We need to contact our religious order, let them know where we are and that we're safe." "Communication arrangements will be made," Captain Rodriguez said, though his tone suggested this was not an immediate priority. "For now, please follow me. I will show you to your accommodations." The building they were led to was clean but Spartan, 2 small rooms connected by a shared bathroom, with simple furnishings that suggested temporary housing rather than comfortable lodging. Each room contained a narrow bed, a small table, a chair, and a window that looked out onto the compound's courtyard. The walls were concrete block, painted an institutional green, and the floors were bare concrete that echoed with their footsteps. Sister Margaret Rose set her suitcase on the bed and looked around the room that was to be her temporary home. It was adequate, but impersonal, the kind of space that was designed for function rather than comfort. More troubling was the realization that the windows, while they provided light and air, were equipped with bars that could be for security, either to keep people out or to keep people in. A guard appeared in the doorway, a young man in military uniform who spoke polite but formal English. "Sisters, dinner will be served in 30 minutes in the dining facility. Someone will come to escort you. If you need anything before then, please let me know." Sister Dorothy approached the guard with the directness that characterized her approach to most situations. "We need to contact our religious order immediately. They will be worried when they don't hear from us, and they need to know that we're safe." "I will pass along your request," the guard replied. "Someone will speak with you about communication procedures tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word carried implications that both sisters found disturbing. Whatever was happening here was clearly not the simple temporary relocation that had been described. The level of security, the isolation of the location, the delays in allowing them to contact their order, all suggested a situation that was more complex and potentially more troubling than they had been led to believe. After the guard left, the sisters sat together in Sister Margaret Rose's room, speaking in voices that were instinctively lowered, despite the fact that they had done nothing wrong and had nothing to hide. "This isn't what they told us," Sister Dorothy said quietly. "This isn't a safe house or temporary lodging. This is some kind of detention facility." Sister Margaret Rose nodded, feeling the same unease that was evident in Dorothy's voice. "The question is why? What do they think we've done, or what do they think we know?" They reviewed the events of the past few days, searching for anything that might have prompted such dramatic action. Their work in the village had been entirely humanitarian. Their interactions with villagers had been open and documented. They had no connections to political groups and no knowledge of military activities. Yet something had triggered this response, something significant enough to justify removing them from their mission and bringing them to this isolated compound. Dinner was served in a small dining facility that reinforced the institutional nature of their surroundings. The food was adequate: rice, beans, chicken, and vegetables prepared without much imagination, but with sufficient nutrition. They ate with several other people who appeared to be staff or personnel associated with the facility, but conversation was limited and formal. No one offered information about the purpose of the compound or the reason for the sisters' presence there. After dinner, they were escorted back to their rooms with the polite but firm guidance that suggested they were expected to remain there for the evening. Sister Margaret Rose attempted to engage their escort in conversation, asking about the facility and the procedures for contacting outside organizations, but received only vague assurances that these matters would be addressed in due course. Once alone in their rooms, The sisters attempted to process the day's events and plan their response to a situation that seemed to be growing more concerning by the hour. Through their windows, they could see guards making regular patrols around the compound perimeter, and the sound of radio communications carried across the courtyard throughout the evening. Sister Margaret Rose tried to find comfort in her evening prayers, but the familiar words felt different in this unfamiliar setting. She prayed for wisdom in understanding their situation, for patience in dealing with circumstances beyond their control, and for the safety of the villagers they had been forced to leave behind. Most of all, she prayed for guidance in knowing how to respond if their situation continued to develop in troubling directions. In the adjoining room, Sister Dorothy was experiencing similar struggles with the uncertainty of their circumstances. She had always been action-oriented, someone who approached problems with determination and energy. But this situation offered no clear course of action, no obvious way to take control or influence outcomes. They were dependent on the decisions of people whose motivations they didn't understand and whose plans they were not being told. The night passed slowly, with both sisters sleeping fitfully and waking frequently to the sounds of the compound around them. Footsteps in corridors, radio communications, vehicles starting and stopping. It was the restless sleep of people who were safe but not secure, protected but not free. Morning brought a guard with breakfast, and the information that they would be meeting with the compound commander at 10 o'clock. "Please be ready," the guard said. "The commander will explain your situation and discuss next steps." The meeting took place in an office that was functional but comfortable, with maps on the walls and a desk that suggested someone of significant authority worked there. The commander, a man in his 50s with grey at his temples, and the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions, introduced himself as Colonel Morales. "Sisters," he began, "I want to apologize for the uncertainty you have experienced since your arrival. I know this situation is difficult, and I appreciate your patience while we work to resolve it." Sister Margaret Rose leaned forward slightly. "Colonel, we appreciate your courtesy, but we need to understand what's happening. We've been brought here without clear explanation. We haven't been allowed to contact our religious order, and we don't know when or if we'll be able to return to our work. Can you help us understand why?" Colonel Morales consulted a file on his desk before responding. "Your mission was located in an area that has become strategically important in current military operations. Intelligence indicates that foreign nationals in that region may become targets of guerrilla activity, either for kidnapping or for elimination as suspected government collaborators." Sister Dorothy shook her head. "But we're not government collaborators. We're humanitarian workers. The villagers know that, everyone knows that. Unfortunately, sister, the distinction between humanitarian worker and government agent is not always clear to all parties in this conflict," Colonel Morales replied. "Your nationality, your funding sources, your presence in a strategically important area, all of these factors could make you targets regardless of your actual activities or loyalties." The explanation had the ring of truth, but it still didn't fully explain their current circumstances. Sister Margaret Rose pressed for more specific information. "If the concern is our safety, why haven't we been taken to San Salvador or allowed to return to the United States? Why are we being held in what appears to be a military facility?" Colonel Morales paused before answering, and in that pause, both sisters sensed that they were approaching the heart of their situation. "There have been additional developments," he said finally. "We have received intelligence suggesting that your mission may have been compromised, that information about your activities and your location may have been passed to guerrilla groups. We need to investigate these reports before we can safely relocate you to a less secure environment." The words fell into the room like cold water. Compromised, intelligence, investigation. Suddenly their situation had moved from protective custody to something that sounded much more like interrogation and suspicion. "What kind of compromise?" Sister Dorothy asked, her voice steady despite the implications of the colonel's words. "We have nothing to hide. Our work was completely open and documented. I understand your position, sister, and I hope that our investigation will confirm what you are telling me," Colonel Morales said. "But until we can verify the security of your situation and the reliability of information we've received, we need to keep you here where we can ensure your safety and complete our inquiries." Sister Margaret Rose felt a chill of understanding. They were not guests at this facility. They were not even refugees seeking protection. They were suspects in something they didn't understand, subjects of an investigation into activities they had never engaged in, prisoners of a situation that seemed to be spiraling beyond anyone's control. The meeting ended with promises of daily updates and assurances that their case was being handled with the utmost priority. But as they were escorted back to their rooms, both sisters understood that they had crossed a line from which return might not be simple or certain. That afternoon, as Sister Margaret Rose sat by her barred window watching guards patrol the compound perimeter, she began to write in her journal with a new sense of urgency. If something happened to them, if this situation continued to deteriorate, someone needed to know what had really occurred. Someone needed to understand that 2 American nuns had been taken from their mission, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had been in the wrong place at a time when being foreign and vulnerable was reason enough for suspicion. She wrote carefully, documenting the events of the past 2 days, the questions they had been asked, the evasions they had received in response to their own questions. She wrote about their work in the village, about the relationships they had built, about the trust that had been shattered by their sudden departure. Most importantly, she wrote about their fears, not just for their own safety, but for the villages they had left behind, for the work that would go unfinished, for the promises of return that they were increasingly unsure they would be able to keep. As evening approached and the compound settled into its nightly routine of patrols and radio checks, Sister Margaret Rose made a decision that would prove crucial 30 years later. She carefully removed several pages from her journal, the pages that contained her most detailed account of their situation and her growing concerns about their fate. Working by the light of her small bedside lamp, she folded the pages as small as possible and concealed them in the only place she could think of where they might remain hidden and safe. Inside the cover of her Bible, in a space she created by carefully separating the binding from the back cover. If something happened to them, she reasoned, someone might eventually find these pages and understand what had really occurred during those crucial days in December 1980. Someone might be able to piece together the truth of what had happened to 2 American nuns who had simply tried to serve where they were needed most. She could not have imagined that it would take 30 years for someone to discover her hidden message, or that the person who found it would be a young archivist going through donated books in a small library in Milwaukee, thousands of miles from the compound where she sat that night, writing words that would finally solve one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of American missionary work. The hidden letter that would eventually emerge from that hollowed-out Bible would reveal not just what happened to Sisters Margaret Rose and Dorothy, but also the complex and troubling circumstances that had made their disappearance seem necessary to those who orchestrated it, and the courage they had shown in documenting the truth, even when they suspected that no one might ever find it. 3 days passed in the compound with the slow, institutional rhythm of controlled time. Sister Margaret Rose and Sister Dorothy established routines within their limited environment: morning prayers in Sister Margaret Rose's room, meals in the dining facility, where conversation remained minimal and guarded, afternoon attempts to read or write, despite the constant awareness of their uncertain situation, and evening prayers before restless nights punctuated by the sounds of a facility that never fully slept. On the 4th morning, December 7th, the routine changed. Instead of the usual guard bringing breakfast and escorting them to the dining facility, Colonel Morales himself appeared at their door, accompanied by 2 officers they had not seen before. His expression was serious in a way that immediately heightened their anxiety. "Sisters," he said without his usual preliminary courtesies, "I need you to gather your belongings immediately. There has been a development that requires us to move you to a different location." Sister Dorothy, who had been preparing for what she hoped would be another meeting about their eventual release, looked up sharply. "What kind of development? Are we being released? Are we going home?" Colonel Morales hesitated before responding, and in that hesitation, both sisters recognized the gravity of whatever news he was about to deliver. "There has been an incident in your village," he said finally. "Guerrilla forces attacked the mission compound yesterday evening. Several buildings were damaged, and there were casualties among the villagers who were in the area. The words hit both sisters like physical blows. Sister Margaret Rose felt her legs weaken and reached for the back of her chair for support. Sister Dorothy made a sound that was part gasp, part cry, and covered her mouth with her hand. "The children," Sister Dorothy whispered. "The families. How many casualties? Who was hurt?" "I don't have complete information," Colonel Morales said, though his tone suggested he knew more than he was sharing. "What I can tell you is that this attack confirms the intelligence we received about threats to foreign nationals in that region. If you had remained at the mission, you would likely have been killed or kidnapped." Sister Margaret Rose found her voice, though it came out strained and barely above a whisper. "We need to go back. The injured, they need medical care. The villagers know us, trust us, we can help." "Absolutely not," Colonel Morales said firmly. "The area is now under military control, and it is far too dangerous for civilians, especially foreign nationals. Your presence would complicate rescue and recovery efforts and put additional lives at risk." The logic was undeniable, but the emotional impact was devastating. For 3 years, the sisters had been part of that community. The villagers who had been injured or killed were not abstract casualties of political violence. They were friends, neighbors, people whose children they had taught, whose illnesses they had treated, whose celebrations and sorrows they had shared. "This is why we are moving you again," Colonel Morales continued. "The attack on your former mission makes your situation more sensitive. We need to ensure your complete safety while we determine the best way to return you to the United States." Return to the United States. The phrase that should have brought relief instead brought a sense of profound loss. Sister Margaret Rose realized that their work in El Salvador was truly over, that whatever they had built in that village was gone, that the relationships they had cherished were severed not by choice but by violence. They packed their few belongings in numb silence, each lost in private grief for people they could not help, and a community they would never see again. Sister Margaret Rose carefully ensured that her Bible, with its hidden pages, remained secure in her bag. The account she had written seemed even more important now. It might be the only record of the final days of a mission that had been destroyed, and of villagers whose suffering might otherwise go unnoticed by the outside world. The journey to their new location took most of the day and followed an even more circuitous route through remote mountain roads. This time, they traveled in a convoy of 3 vehicles with additional security, and the atmosphere was tense in a way that their previous transfer had not been. Radio communications were more frequent and conducted in code words that meant nothing to the sisters, but clearly carried urgent significance for their escorts. Their destination was another compound, but this one was clearly more permanent and more secure than the previous facility. Higher walls, more guards, and a general atmosphere that suggested this was a place where serious, long-term business was conducted, rather than temporary housing. The buildings were larger and better constructed, and the presence of communications equipment was more extensive. Colonel Morales did not accompany them to this new location. Instead, they were met by a different officer, Major Santos, a younger man with an intensity that made even routine interactions feel charged with importance. His English was excellent, and his manner was professional but less reassuring than Colonel Morales had been. "Sisters," Major Santos said as they were shown to their new quarters, "you will be staying here while we complete arrangements for your repatriation to the United States. This is a secure facility, and we ask that you follow all security protocols for your own safety and the safety of personnel here." The new quarters were better appointed than their previous rooms, larger spaces with more comfortable furniture and private bathrooms, but the windows were higher and smaller, and the sense of being confined was more pronounced. More troubling was the realization that this facility seemed designed for longer-term occupancy. These were not temporary accommodations. They were living spaces for people who might be staying for weeks or months, rather than days. That evening, as they sat together in Sister Margaret Rose's room, sharing a dinner that had been brought to them rather than served in a common dining area, both sisters struggled to process the implications of their new situation. The attack on their village had fundamentally changed everything. They were no longer simply foreign nationals being relocated for safety reasons. They were witnesses to circumstances that had political and military significance. "They're not going to let us go home," Sister Dorothy said quietly, voicing the fear that both of them had been reluctant to acknowledge. "Not soon, anyway. We know too much about what happened, even if we don't understand all of it. Sister Margaret Rose nodded slowly. The attack on the village, it wasn't random, was it? Someone knew we had been removed. Someone knew the mission would be empty or nearly empty when they attacked. The implications were disturbing. If the attack had been timed to coincide with their removal, it suggested a level of coordination and intelligence that made their own situation far more complex than simple protective custody. They might be witnesses not just to the attack itself, but to the circumstances that had made it possible. Over the following days, their isolation became more complete. They were no longer allowed to leave their quarters without escort, and their requests to contact their religious order continued to be deferred with vague promises of future communication opportunities. The daily meetings with facility commanders stopped, replaced by brief visits from guards who provided meals, and checked on their basic needs, but offered no information about their situation or their future. Sister Margaret Rose continued to write in her journal, but now she wrote with the awareness that her words might be the only record of their experience that would survive whatever was planned for them. She documented the progression of their confinement, the increasing restrictions on their movement and communication, and her growing certainty that they were being held not for their protection, but for reasons that were not being explained to them. On December 15th, 13 days after their removal from the village, Major Santos made an unexpected visit to their quarters. His manner was more formal than usual, and he was accompanied by 2 soldiers who remained standing by the door throughout their conversation. "Sisters," he said, "I have been asked to inform you that your case has been reviewed at the highest levels of government. Due to the sensitive nature of the intelligence related to your situation, it has been determined that your repatriation to the United States must be delayed indefinitely." Sister Dorothy stood up from her chair with an expression of disbelief and anger. "Delayed indefinitely? What does that mean? You can't just hold us here without charges, without explanation, without even allowing us to contact our families." Major Santos remained calm but firm. "The security situation related to your case continues to evolve. Until that situation is resolved, your safety and the safety of others requires that you remain in protective custody at this facility." "This isn't protective custody," Sister Margaret Rose said quietly. "This is imprisonment. We are being held against our will without due process, without legal representation, without any of the rights that should be guaranteed to us as American citizens." "Your case is being handled through appropriate diplomatic channels," Major Santos replied. "Your government has been informed of your situation and is working with our government to resolve it as quickly as possible." The claim that their government had been informed should have been reassuring, but something in Major Santos's tone suggested that the diplomatic resolution he mentioned was not proceeding in their favor. Sister Margaret Rose had the chilling realization that they might have become bargaining chips in negotiations that had nothing to do with their individual circumstances and everything to do with larger political considerations they were not being told about. After Major Santos left, the sisters sat together in profound silence, finally acknowledging the full gravity of their situation. They were not going home. They were not going to be released. They had become inconvenient witnesses to events that someone wanted to keep quiet, and their continued silence was apparently worth more than their freedom. That night, Sister Margaret Rose added more pages to her hidden documentation, writing with desperate urgency about the progression of their confinement and her growing certainty that they were being held indefinitely. She wrote about the attack on their village, about the questions they had been asked, about the increasing restrictions on their freedom. Most importantly, she wrote about her fear that no one would ever know what had really happened to them, that they would simply disappear into the bureaucratic machinery of a conflict that was larger than individual lives, larger than justice, larger than truth. She could not have known that her hidden pages would indeed preserve the truth for 30 years, waiting in the hollowed-out cover of her Bible for someone to discover them and finally understand the real story of what had happened to 2 American nuns who had vanished from El Salvador during the dark days of December 1980. The silence that would follow their disappearance was about to begin, and it would last until a young archivist in Milwaukee, cataloging donated books in 2010, would notice that one particular Bible felt heavier than it should, and would make the discovery that would finally solve one of the most enduring mysteries of the Central American conflicts, revealing not just what had happened to Sisters Margaret Rose and Dorothy, but also the courage they had shown in documenting the truth, even when they believed that no one would ever find it. December blended into January with the slow, oppressive rhythm of captivity. Sister Margaret Rose and Sister Dorothy had been in the second compound for 3 weeks, and their world had contracted to the dimensions of their quarters, the narrow hallway that connected their rooms, and the small courtyard where they were occasionally allowed to walk under guard supervision. The mountain air that had once seemed fresh and invigorating now felt thin and cold, carrying the scent of distant wood smoke that reminded them of villages they could no longer reach. Their daily routine had become a careful balance between maintaining dignity and acknowledging the reality of their powerlessness. They rose each morning for private prayers, shared simple meals delivered to their quarters, and spent long hours reading, writing, and attempting to process the inexplicable circumstances that had transformed them from missionaries into prisoners. Their conversations had grown quieter, more careful, as they became increasingly aware that their captivity might be permanent. Sister Margaret Rose continued her documentation with methodical determination, adding details to her hidden pages about their treatment, their requests for legal representation that went unanswered, and their growing certainty that official channels were not working to secure their release. She wrote about the guards who treated them with professional courtesy, but clear instructions to maintain distance, about the meals that were adequate but institutional, about the silence from the outside world that felt more ominous with each passing day. On January 15, 1981, Major Santos made another unexpected visit to their quarters. This time he was alone, and his manner was different, less formal, more troubled. He sat across from them in Sister Margaret Rose's room, with the posture of someone delivering news that he found personally difficult. "Sisters," he began, then paused as if searching for the right words. "I have received new instructions regarding your situation. There have been developments in the investigation related to your case that require us to take additional security measures." Sister Dorothy leaned forward with an expression that mixed hope with apprehension. "Does that mean we're being released? Are we finally going home?" Major Santos shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid not. The developments I'm referring to involve intelligence suggesting that your continued presence here may compromise ongoing operations. It has been determined that you need to be relocated again to a more secure facility where your situation can be handled with appropriate discretion." The euphemistic language was becoming familiar, but its implications were increasingly ominous. Sister Margaret Rose studied Major Santos's face, noting the tension around his eyes and the way he avoided direct eye contact. "Major, with respect, we've been relocated twice now, each time to places that are more isolated and more restrictive. What you're describing sounds less like enhanced security and more like preparation for something final." Major Santos was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Sisters, I want you to understand that this situation has moved beyond my authority to influence. The decisions being made about your case are coming from levels of government where individual circumstances are weighed against broader strategic considerations." Sister Dorothy stood up abruptly, her usual composure finally cracking under the strain of weeks of uncertainty and evasion. "Strategic considerations? We're human beings, not chess pieces. We're American citizens who are doing humanitarian work. We have rights. We have families who must be desperate for news about us. We have lives that matter." "I understand your frustration," Major Santos said quietly, "and I want you to know that I have advocated for your release through every channel available to me. But there are factors in your case that make a simple resolution impossible." Sister Margaret Rose felt a chill of final understanding. "The attack on our village, it wasn't a random guerrilla action, was it? Someone in the government knew it was going to happen. Someone wanted those villagers to suffer, and our removal was part of ensuring that the attack would be successful." Major Santos's silence was more revealing than any verbal confirmation could have been. His inability to deny her accusation, combined with his obvious discomfort, confirmed what both sisters had begun to suspect. They were witnesses to war crimes, and their testimony could destroy careers and embarrass governments. "When do we leave?" Sister Margaret Rose asked quietly. "Tomorrow morning," Major Santos replied. "Please prepare your belongings tonight. The journey will be longer this time, and the destination is more remote. Communication will be even more limited than it has been here." After he left, the sisters sat together in the gathering darkness of their quarters, finally acknowledging what they had been trying not to believe for weeks. This was not going to end with their release. They were not going home. They were being moved deeper into a system that was designed to make people disappear quietly and permanently. Sister Dorothy broke the silence first. "They're going to kill us, aren't they?" Sister Margaret Rose had been thinking the same thing, but hearing the words spoken aloud made them feel both more real and more impossible to accept. "I think," she said carefully, "that we know things that powerful people want to keep secret, and I think those people have decided that our silence is more important than our lives." That night, Sister Margaret Rose wrote what she believed would be her final entry in the hidden documentation. Working by candlelight after the electricity was turned off, she wrote about Major Santos's visit, about the implications of another relocation, and about her growing certainty that they were being prepared for elimination rather than release. She wrote about the villagers who had been killed in the attack on their mission, about the children who had trusted them with their education, about the women who had depended on their medical clinic. She wrote about the life they had built in El Salvador, and the work that had been destroyed not by accident but by design. Most importantly, she wrote about her faith, not the simple, unquestioned faith of her youth, but the complex, tested faith of someone who had seen both the best and worst of human nature, who had experienced both profound love and incomprehensible cruelty, who could still believe in goodness while acknowledging the reality of evil. "If someone finds these pages," she wrote, "know that we did not die in vain. We tried to serve where we were needed most. We tried to love without condition. We tried to stand with those who had no voice. If that made us dangerous to those in power, then we accept that danger as the cost of living according to our conscience." She folded the final pages carefully and added them to the others hidden in her Bible's cover, sealing them as carefully as possible to protect them from moisture and decay. Then she sat in the darkness, praying not for rescue. She no longer believed that was possible, but for the strength to face whatever was coming with dignity and courage. The next morning came too early and too late. Sister Margaret Rose and Sister Dorothy packed their few belongings for what they both understood would be their final journey. They prayed together in the dawn light, finding comfort in familiar words that had sustained them through years of service and would sustain them through whatever hours remained. The vehicle that came for them was different from the others, older, less official, with civilian license plates instead of government markings. The men who escorted them were not in uniform and spoke little during the loading of their luggage. Everything about the arrangement suggested an operation that was designed to leave no official record, no paper trail that could later be investigated or questioned. As they drove through the Salvadoran countryside for what they knew would be the last time, both sisters found themselves memorizing details. The way morning mist clung to coffee plantations, the sight of children walking to school along dusty roads, the sound of church bells carrying across valleys, the simple beauty of a landscape that had become their adopted home. Sister Dorothy reached across the space between them and took Sister Margaret Rose's hand. No words were necessary. They had shared everything that mattered: their faith, their work, their hope for the people they had served, and now their fate. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, as they had faced everything else during their years in El Salvador. The vehicle climbed higher into the mountains, following roads that became progressively smaller and more remote. After several hours, they stopped at what appeared to be an abandoned mining camp, rough buildings scattered across a mountainside clearing, with no signs of current habitation and no evidence of official presence. This was not a facility. This was not a compound. This was simply a place where things could happen quietly, without witnesses, without records, without accountability. Sister Margaret Rose clutched her Bible tightly as they were led from the vehicle. Inside its cover, the pages she had written waited with their testimony, about 2 American nuns who had tried to serve with love and had disappeared into the machinery of a conflict that was larger than individual lives, larger than justice, larger than truth. The silence of the mountains surrounded them, broken only by the wind through the pine trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was, Sister Margaret Rose thought, A beautiful place to die if dying was what was required of them. She could not have imagined that her hidden pages would survive what was about to happen, that 30 years later they would be discovered by someone who would finally tell their story, that the truth she had documented would emerge from darkness into light, giving voice to those who had been silenced and meaning to sacrifice that had seemed to disappear without trace. The mountains kept their secrets for 3 decades, but mountains, unlike people, do not forget. And sometimes, when the time is right, even the deepest secrets find their way back into the light. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the small Catholic library, attached to St. Mary's Parish, creating a steady rhythm that seemed to underscore the quiet concentration of the young woman sorting through boxes of donated books. Sarah Chen had been working as a volunteer archivist for 6 months, helping to catalogue and organise the thousands of volumes that had been donated to the parish library over the years. It was not glamorous work, but it was peaceful, and it connected her to something larger than herself during a period when she was trying to figure out what came next in her life. At 26, Sarah was between graduate school and whatever career would eventually claim her. She had completed her master's degree in library science 3 months earlier and was using her volunteer work at St. Mary's to gain practical experience while she applied for professional positions. The parish library project was ambitious. They were attempting to create a comprehensive archive of Catholic literature, missionary accounts, and religious texts that could serve as a resource for researchers and students of religious history. The October afternoon was growing dark early, and Sarah was working alone in the library's back room, surrounded by cardboard boxes that contained the personal effects of recently deceased parishioners. These donations often included Bibles, prayer books, religious art, and sometimes personal papers that family members felt were too sacred to simply throw away, but didn't know how to preserve properly. She was examining a box donated by the family of Margaret Kowalski, an elderly woman who had been active in the parish's missionary support programs for decades. Most of the contents were predictable: well-worn prayer books, devotional literature, rosaries, and several Bibles in various states of use. But one Bible felt different when Sarah picked it up, heavier than it should be, and slightly unbalanced, as if something inside was shifting when she moved it. Sarah had handled hundreds of Bibles during her months of volunteer work, and she had developed an instinctive sense for their normal weight and feel. This one was definitely unusual. She examined it more carefully, noting that it was a standard King James version from the 1970s, bound in black leather, that showed significant wear but was still in good condition. The cover was embossed with the simple gold lettering that was typical of Bibles from that era. When she opened it, the pages seemed normal. The familiar text in traditional formatting, with some passages underlined and occasional margin notes in a careful feminine handwriting. But when she reached the back of the Bible, she noticed that the cover felt loose, as if the binding had been damaged or deliberately altered. Curious now, Sarah examined the back cover more carefully. Working gently, she was able to separate the leather cover from the internal binding, revealing a small cavity that had been carefully created between the cover and the back pages. Inside this hidden space were several folded sheets of paper, yellowed with age and written in the same careful handwriting she had noticed in the margin notes. Sarah's heart began to beat faster as she realized she might have discovered something significant. The papers were clearly very old, and their hidden placement suggested they contained information that someone had considered important enough to conceal. She unfolded them carefully, mindful of their fragile condition, and began to read. The first page was dated December 15, 1980, and began with words that immediately captured her attention. "If someone finds these pages, know that we did not die in vain. We tried to serve where we were needed most." Sarah sat down heavily in the nearest chair, recognizing immediately that she was holding something extraordinary. The handwriting continued. "My name is Sister Margaret Rose Peterson, and I am writing this account of our final weeks in El Salvador because I believe that no one else will tell this story if we do not survive to tell it ourselves." The pages that followed contained a detailed account of the final days of 2 American nuns who had vanished from El Salvador during the political violence of 1980. Sarah read with growing amazement as Sister Margaret Rose's careful documentation revealed the true story behind their disappearance. Not the heroic martyrdom that had been assumed, but a complex web of political calculations, military operations, and government cover-ups that had made their elimination seem necessary to those in power. Sister Margaret Rose had written about their work in the village, about the relationships they had built with the local people, about the sudden arrival of government officials who forced them to leave their mission for supposed safety reasons. She had documented their journey from protective custody to imprisonment, from uncertainty to the growing realization that they were being held not for their protection, but because they had become inconvenient witnesses to events that powerful people wanted to keep secret. Most shocking was Sister Margaret Rose's account of the attack on their village, the attack that had killed villagers they had served and loved, and that had apparently been timed to coincide with their removal from the area. The implications were staggering. Government officials had not only known about the attack in advance, but had orchestrated the removal of the American nuns to ensure that the attack would succeed without foreign witnesses. Sarah continued reading as the afternoon light faded completely and the library around her grew dark. She was completely absorbed in Sister Margaret Rose's narrative, feeling as if she was experiencing those final weeks alongside the two women who had documented their ordeal with such courage and clarity. The final entry, dated January 16, 1981, was brief but haunting. They are moving us again today to what Major Santos described as a more secure facility. Dorothy and I both understand what this means. We have become too dangerous to remain alive. I am sealing these pages in my Bible in the hope that someday someone will find them and understand what really happened to us. We were not heroes. We were simply two women who tried to serve God by serving others, and who found ourselves caught in events larger than our ability to control or escape. If our deaths serve any purpose, let it be to remind people that truth matters, that the vulnerable deserve protection, and that those who speak for justice must be heard even when, especially when, they can no longer speak for themselves. Sarah sat in the darkened library for a long time after finishing the hidden letter, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had discovered. This was not just a historical curiosity or an interesting archival find. This was evidence of crimes that had never been investigated, of a cover-up that had succeeded for 30 years, of two women whose fate had been hidden from their families, their religious order, and the world. She understood immediately that this discovery would have profound implications. The mystery of what had happened to Sisters Margaret Rose and Dorothy had never been solved. Their disappearance had been the subject of investigations, congressional inquiries, and decades of speculation. Officially, they had simply vanished during the political violence that swept El Salvador in the early 1980s, presumed dead, but with no concrete evidence of their fate. Sister Margaret Rose's hidden account changed everything. It provided not just answers to questions that had persisted for 30 years, but evidence of government complicity in their disappearance and in the attack on the village they had served. It revealed a level of calculation and cover-up that transformed their story from tragedy to scandal. Sarah carefully refolded the pages and placed them back in their hiding place in the Bible's cover, understanding that she was now responsible for documents that could rewrite the historical record of American missionary work in Central America. She needed to contact experts, authorities, people who could verify the authenticity of the documents and ensure that their revelations would be properly investigated and publicized. But first, she sat in the quiet darkness of the library and said a prayer for two women she had never met, but whose courage and faith had reached across 30 years to finally tell their story. Sister Margaret Rose and Sister Dorothy had not died in vain. Their truth had survived, hidden but preserved, waiting for the right moment and the right person to bring it back into the light. The silence that had surrounded their disappearance was finally broken. The mystery that had endured for 3 decades was finally solved. And the story of two American nuns who had vanished from El Salvador in 1980 could finally be told with the complexity, honesty, and respect that their sacrifice deserved. As Sarah prepared to leave the library that night, carrying the Bible and its precious hidden contents, she understood that she had become part of their story now. She was the voice they had hoped for, but could never be certain would come. The witness they had trusted with their final testimony, the bridge between their silenced truth and a world that still needed to hear it. The 30 years of silence were over. The real story could finally begin. The fluorescent lights of the FBI field office in Milwaukee hummed with the same persistent intensity that had characterized Sarah Chen's week since her discovery of the hidden letter. Across from her sat Special Agent Patricia Williams, a woman in her 50s whose gray-streaked hair and methodical manner suggested decades of experience with complex investigations. Between them on the metal table lay Sister Margaret Rose's Bible, its hidden compartment now exposed, and the carefully preserved pages that had waited 30 years to reveal their secrets. "Miss Chen," Agent Williams said, closing the file folder she had been reviewing, "I want you to understand the significance of what you've brought to us. These documents, if authentic, provide the first concrete evidence of what happened to Sisters Margaret Rose Peterson and Dorothy Sullivan. Their disappearance has been an open case with our International Crimes Unit for 3 decades. Sarah nodded, still processing the surreal nature of her situation. A week ago, she had been a volunteer librarian, organizing donated books. Now she was sitting in a federal building, watching agents photograph and analyze documents that could rewrite the official history of American involvement in Central American conflicts. The preliminary analysis of the paper, ink, and handwriting all support the document's authenticity, Agent Williams continued. The paper matches samples from the early 1980s, the ink has aged consistently with the claimed time frame, and handwriting experts have compared the text to verified samples of Sister Margaret Rose's writing from her personnel files. Everything checks out so far. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a historian from the University of Wisconsin who specialized in Central American conflicts, had been brought in to provide context for the discovery. He sat beside Agent Williams, his own notes spread across the table as he worked to verify the historical details contained in Sister Margaret Rose's account. The events described in these pages align precisely with what we know about the political situation in El Salvador during December 1980 and January 1981, Dr. Rodriguez said. The military operations, the locations mentioned, the governmental structures described, all of it fits with documented historical facts. But more importantly, these pages fill in gaps that historians have been trying to understand for decades. Agent Williams turned to a fresh page in her notepad. "Miss Chen, I need to ask you some questions about how you discovered these documents and who else has had access to them." Sarah recounted the story of her volunteer work, her discovery of the unusually heavy Bible, and her decision to contact authorities immediately after reading the hidden pages. She had told no one else about her discovery, understanding instinctively that the information was too sensitive to share casually. "The Bible was donated as part of Margaret Kowalski's estate," Sarah explained. According to the parish records, Mrs. Kowalski was active in missionary support programs and had corresponded with various missionaries over the years. It's possible that Sister Margaret Rose sent the Bible to her before the events described in the letter, or that it somehow made its way to Mrs. Kowalski through other channels. Dr. Rodriguez looked up from his notes. "Actually, that connection makes perfect sense historically. During the early 1980s, many American missionaries maintained correspondence with supporters in their home parishes. If Sister Margaret Rose knew that her situation was becoming dangerous, she might have mailed personal items back to the United States for safekeeping." Agent Williams made a note and continued her questioning. "Have you had any contact from anyone else about this discovery? Any unusual phone calls, visits, or inquiries?" "No," Sarah replied. "I contacted the FBI as soon as I realized what I had found. I haven't spoken to anyone else about it." "Good," Agent Williams said. "We're going to need to keep this discovery confidential while we conduct our investigation. The information in these documents could have serious implications for individuals who are still alive, and we need to verify everything carefully before making any public announcements." Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself drawn into an investigation that expanded far beyond what she had initially imagined. The FBI's International Crimes Unit worked with State Department officials, Central American historians, and human rights organizations to verify the details contained in Sister Margaret Rose's account and to trace the fate of other individuals mentioned in her narrative. The investigation revealed a complex web of governmental and military operations that had been classified for decades. Through Freedom of Information Act requests and diplomatic inquiries, investigators were able to confirm many of the details that Sister Margaret Rose had documented. The increased military activity in her region during December 1980, the involvement of government security forces in removing foreign nationals from sensitive areas, and the timing of guerrilla attacks that had coincided with these removals. Most significantly, investigators were able to locate and interview several individuals who had been involved in the events described in the hidden letter. Major Santos, now a retired general living in Guatemala, initially denied any knowledge of the American nuns' fate. But when confronted with specific details from Sister Margaret Rose's account, he eventually acknowledged his role in their detention and transport. "They knew too much," he admitted during a recorded interview. The attack on their village was part of a larger military operation designed to clear the area of civilian witnesses before we moved against guerrilla positions. The nuns had been removed for their own safety, but when the operation was completed, they had become security risks themselves. The revelation confirmed what Sister Margaret Rose had suspected. She and Sister Dorothy had been eliminated not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had witnessed the preparation for war crimes, and their testimony could have exposed government complicity in the deaths of innocent civilians. Dr. Rodriguez worked with colleagues in El Salvador to investigate the attack on the village that Sister Margaret Rose had described. Local records previously sealed or destroyed were gradually recovered through the efforts of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that had been established to document human rights abuses from the Civil War period. The attack killed 17 villagers, Dr. Rodriguez reported to Agent Williams during one of their regular meetings. Most were women and children who had taken shelter in the mission compound, believing it would be safer than their own homes. The official report at the time blamed guerrilla forces, but we now have evidence that government troops conducted the attack and blamed it on their opponents. As the investigation progressed, Sarah found herself serving as more than just the discoverer of the documents. Agent Williams asked her to work with the FBI's Victim Services Division to help contact the families of Sisters Margaret Rose and Dorothy. After 30 years of uncertainty, these families would finally learn what had happened to their daughters and sisters. The phone call to Margaret Rose Peterson's surviving brother in Milwaukee was one of the most difficult conversations Sarah had ever had. James Peterson, now in his 70s, had never stopped hoping that his sister might someday return or that someone would discover what had happened to her. "She was always the brave one," he told Sarah through tears. Even as children, she was the one who stood up for others, who couldn't bear to see anyone suffer. I'm not surprised that she tried to document what was happening, even when she knew it might cost her life. Sister Dorothy's family, contacted through the religious order that had sponsored her work, responded with similar mixtures of grief and gratitude. Her younger sister, now a grandmother herself, had spent 30 years wondering if Dorothy had suffered, if she had been afraid, if she had died alone. Knowing that she was with Sister Margaret Rose at the end, that they faced it together, brings me some peace, she said. And knowing that she died because she had tried to help innocent people, that's exactly who Dorothy was. She would have considered it a worthy reason to die. 6 months after Sarah's discovery, Agent Williams called a press conference to announce the resolution of one of the longest-standing missing persons cases in FBI history. The conference room was packed with reporters, representatives from human rights organizations, members of the victims' families, and officials from the Catholic Church. The investigation into the disappearance of Sisters Margaret Rose Peterson and Dorothy Sullivan has been conclusively resolved, Agent Williams announced. Evidence discovered earlier this year has provided definitive answers to questions that have persisted for 30 years and has revealed the circumstances that led to their deaths. She went on to describe the discovery of Sister Margaret Rose's hidden letter and the subsequent investigation that had confirmed its contents. The revelation that the 2 nuns had been murdered not by guerrilla forces, as had been assumed, but by government operatives seeking to silence witnesses to war crimes, sent shockwaves through religious communities and human rights organizations. The courage shown by Sister Margaret Rose in documenting these events, even when she knew that her own life was in danger, has finally allowed the truth to emerge. Agent Williams continued. Her decision to hide this account, where it might someday be discovered, has provided justice not only for herself and Sister Dorothy, but for the villagers who died in the attack they witnessed, and for the families who have spent 30 years not knowing what happened to their loved ones. Sarah, sitting in the back of the conference room, felt the weight of history settling around her. She had begun this journey as a volunteer librarian, looking for practical experience. She was ending it as the person who had helped solve one of the most significant human rights cases of the Central American conflicts. But more than that, she had become the fulfillment of Sister Margaret Rose's hope, the someone who would find her hidden pages, understand their significance, and ensure that the truth would finally be told. The silence that had surrounded their disappearance for 30 years had been broken, and their story could finally be told with the complexity, honesty, and respect that their sacrifice deserved. As the press conference ended and reporters dispersed to file their stories, Sarah remained in her seat, thinking about two women she had never met, but whose courage had reached across 3 decades to finally claim justice. Sister Margaret Rose and Sister Dorothy had not died in vain. Their truth had survived, their story had been told, and their sacrifice had finally been acknowledged by a world that had forgotten them for too long. The Bible that had preserved their secret sat in an evidence locker now, its mission complete. But the words it had protected, words of faith, courage, and unwavering commitment to truth, would live on in the historical record, ensuring that future generations would know the full story of 2 American nuns who had vanished from El Salvador in 1980, and whose voices had finally returned to bear witness to events that had been hidden in silence for 30 long years. The small chapel at Marquette University was filled with an unusual mixture of people on the grey November morning when the memorial service for Sisters Margaret Rose Peterson and Dorothy Sullivan was finally held. Academic researchers sat beside elderly parishioners from St. Mary's. Human rights activists shared pews with family members who had waited 31 years to properly mourn their loved ones. Representatives from the FBI and State Department sat quietly in the back, their presence a reminder of the official nature of the recognition that was finally being given to 2 women whose deaths had been hidden for decades. Sarah Chen sat in the 3rd row, still processing the year that had transformed her from a volunteer librarian into an accidental historian. The simple memorial service was the culmination of months of legal proceedings, diplomatic negotiations, and historical verification that had confirmed every detail of Sister Margaret Rose's hidden account. More importantly, it represented the moment when 2 forgotten voices were finally being heard by the world they had tried so hard to serve. Father Michael O'Brien, the university chaplain, stood at the simple wooden podium that had been placed in front of the altar. In his hands, he held a copy of Sister Margaret Rose's letter, not the original which remained in federal custody as evidence, but a carefully prepared transcript that had been verified and authenticated by multiple agencies. "We gather today," Father O'Brien began, "not just to mourn 2 lives that were taken too soon, but to celebrate the courage that preserved truth when truth was dangerous, that documented injustice when injustice was powerful, and that maintained faith when faith required the ultimate sacrifice." The service had been organized by Dr. Rodriguez and his colleagues at the university's Center for Latin American Studies, working in cooperation with the families of both women and the religious order that had sponsored their missionary work. What had begun as Sarah's discovery in a dusty library had evolved into a comprehensive historical project that was reshaping understanding of American involvement in Central American conflicts. Dr. Rodriguez had spent the past year working with colleagues in El Salvador to establish a memorial in the village where Sisters Margaret Rose and Dorothy had served. The memorial honored not only the 2 American nuns, but also the 17 villagers who had died in the attack that the sisters had witnessed and documented. For the first time, those civilian deaths were being officially acknowledged as war crimes rather than casualties of guerrilla violence. The village memorial was dedicated last month, Dr. Rodriguez had told Sarah during one of their regular meetings. The surviving villagers, many of whom are now grandparents themselves, gathered to remember not just the tragedy of that December night, but the 3 years of hope and healing that Sisters Margaret Rose and Dorothy had brought to their community. The investigation that had followed Sarah's discovery had revealed much more than the fate of 2 missing nuns. Sister Margaret Rose's detailed documentation had provided evidence that led to broader investigations of human rights violations during the Central American conflicts. Several former military officers had been indicted for war crimes, and diplomatic relationships between the United States and El Salvador had been strained as both governments struggled to address the implications of decades-old cover-ups. But perhaps more significantly, the story had inspired a new generation of human rights advocates and researchers who were working to uncover other hidden truths from conflicts around the world. Sarah had received letters from students, activists, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by the courage that Sister Margaret Rose had shown in documenting the truth even when she believed no one would ever discover it. James Peterson, Sister Margaret Rose's brother, stood slowly as Father O'Brien invited him to share memories of his sister. At 73, he moved carefully, but his voice was strong as he approached the podium. "My Sister Margaret Rose always believed that every person mattered," he said, looking out at the assembled congregation. "She used to say that if you could help one person, save one life, ease one burden, then your own life had meaning." She and Sister Dorothy helped far more than one person during their time in El Salvador, and their courage in documenting the truth has helped many more people find justice and closure. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "But I think what would matter most to Margaret Rose is that her story has reminded people that truth is worth preserving, even when it's dangerous. Especially when it's dangerous." She and Sister Dorothy died because they had witnessed the truth, and they chose to document it rather than pretend it hadn't happened. Sister Catherine Brennan, the current superior of the religious order that had sponsored Sisters Margaret Rose and Dorothy, spoke next about the impact their story had had on contemporary missionary work. "Their sacrifice has reminded us that serving others sometimes requires courage beyond what we think we possess," she said. "They have shown us that speaking for those who have no voice is not just a calling, but a responsibility that we must be prepared to fulfill regardless of the cost." The service included readings from Sister Margaret Rose's hidden letter, passages that had been carefully selected to honor both the women's memory and the villagers they had tried to protect. Her words, written in desperate circumstances 30 years earlier, took on the quality of Scripture as they were read aloud in the respectful silence of the chapel. "We were not heroes," Father O'Brien read from the letter. "We were simply 2 women who tried to serve God by serving others, and who found ourselves caught in events larger than our ability to control or escape. If our deaths serve any purpose, let it be to remind people that truth matters, that the vulnerable deserve protection, and that those who speak for justice must be heard even when, especially when, they can no longer speak for themselves." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to words that had been written in darkness and fear, but had survived to bring light and understanding. The young woman who had discovered these pages in a dusty library had been forever changed by her encounter with such profound courage and faith. After the service, as people gathered in the university's community center for a reception, Sarah found herself in conversation with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a researcher from Guatemala, who had traveled to Milwaukee specifically to attend the memorial. Dr. Vasquez had been working for years to document human rights violations in Central America, and Sister Margaret Rose's letter had provided crucial evidence for several of her investigations. "Your discovery has been more important than you may realize," Dr. Vasquez told Sarah. "The documentation that Sister Margaret Rose provided has helped us establish patterns of government involvement in civilian deaths that we had suspected but could never prove. Her courage in writing that letter has brought justice to many families besides her own." Sarah nodded, still struggling to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had emerged from her simple discovery. "I keep thinking about how close it came to never being found," she said. "If Mrs. Kowalski's family had donated those books to a different organization, if someone else had been sorting through them, if the Bible had been damaged over the years, there were so many ways that the truth could have remained hidden forever." "But it wasn't hidden forever," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Maybe that's the real miracle here. Sister Margaret Rose trusted that someday someone would find her words and understand their importance. She had faith that the truth would eventually emerge, even if she couldn't see how that would happen. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself talking with family members of both women, with researchers who were using their story to investigate other human rights cases, and with students who had been inspired to pursue careers in human rights law or international justice. The impact of Sister Margaret Rose's hidden letter continued to ripple outward, touching lives and inspiring action in ways that she could never have imagined when she wrote those pages in fear and darkness. Near the end of the reception, James Peterson approached Sarah with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I wanted to give you this," he said. "It belonged to Margaret Rose when she was young, before she became a nun. I think she would want you to have it." Sarah unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a small leather journal with blank pages. Inside the front cover, in the same careful handwriting she had come to know so well, was an inscription: "For recording the stories that matter, MRP." She kept a journal from the time she was 12 years old, James explained. She always said that writing helped her understand what was happening around her and figure out how she should respond. "I think she would appreciate knowing that her final letter was discovered by someone who understands the importance of preserving stories." Sarah held the journal carefully, feeling the weight of connection across decades. In some sense, her story and Sister Margaret Rose's story had become intertwined. One woman had documented truth in desperate circumstances, and another had discovered that truth and helped bring it into the light. As the memorial reception came to an end, and people began to say their goodbyes, Sarah walked outside into the November afternoon. The autumn air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. She thought about Sister Margaret Rose and Sister Dorothy, about the village in El Salvador where they had served, about the families who had finally received answers to questions that had haunted them for 30 years. The mystery that had begun with 2 American nuns vanishing from El Salvador in 1980 had finally been solved. But the story that had emerged was larger than just the resolution of a missing persons case. It was a story about courage and faith, about the importance of bearing witness to injustice, about the power of truth to survive even when those who speak it are silenced. Sister Margaret Rose had ended her hidden letter with words that had proven prophetic. "If someone finds these pages, know that we did not die in vain." Sarah understood now that her role had been to ensure that this message reached the world, that the voices of 2 women who had been silenced could finally be heard, that their sacrifice could finally be understood and honored. The Bible that had preserved their secret was now part of the historical record, displayed in the university's archives, where researchers and students could study Sister Margaret Rose's actual handwriting and understand the conditions under which her testimony had been written. But the words themselves had taken on a life of their own, inspiring investigations, memorial services, legal proceedings, and countless individual acts of courage by people who had been moved by the story of 2 women who had chosen truth over safety. As Sarah walked across the university campus, holding the journal that had belonged to Sister Margaret Rose as a young woman, she thought about the stories that still waited to be discovered, the truths that still needed to be documented, the voices that still needed to be heard. The work that Sister Margaret Rose and Sister Dorothy had begun in a small Salvadoran village continued in different forms, carried forward by people who understood that bearing witness to injustice and speaking for those who have no voice remains as important today as it was 30 years ago. The silence that had surrounded their disappearance was finally broken. The truth that they had preserved at the cost of their lives had finally emerged. And their story would continue to inspire others to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and service over safety, exactly as they had done during their final days in El Salvador, when they had documented injustice with the faith that someday, somehow, someone would find their words and understand that truth, like hope, has the power to survive even the deepest darkness. The mystery was solved, the truth was told, the legacy lived on.